Picture yourself opening your eyes in Georgian Britain. The atmosphere reeks of coal smoke, raw sewage, and animal waste, but those foul odors are the least of your concerns. Your true nightmare begins when you realize that a single misstep, getting too drunk, snatching something small, or offending the wrong aristocrat could thrust you into torment so horrifying that you would beg for a swift end. This was an era where the law had nothing to do with fairness. Instead, it operated like a twisted theater production, savage and orchestrated to transform your agony into a public spectacle painted in crimson. Consider the most common form of state-sanctioned death, the public gallows. These executions made today's harshest prison terms seem like gentle reprimands by comparison. Death was never the simple goal. The authorities crafted each killing into a grand show for massive audiences. The doomed individual would ride through streets in an open wagon, noose already cinched around their throat, while thousands gathered as though attending the season's most anticipated event. Street merchants hawked snacks, beer, and commemorative trinkets as spectators fought for prime viewing positions to witness the final drop. Here comes the most disturbing element. The platform was intentionally constructed to prevent instant death through neck fracture. Instead, authorities deliberately created a shallow fall, guaranteeing the victim would swing helplessly for extended periods, sometimes 30 excruciating minutes, gasping and clawing desperately at the rope while slowly suffocating as the mob cheered wildly. This represented entertainment for onlookers, yet for the condemned soul, it meant prolonged torment. Should sympathetic friends be present, they might sprint forward and pull violently on your dangling legs, hastening death through mercy. Imagine being caught cheating someone out of coins or perhaps spreading vicious rumors about a fellow citizen. Your fate? The pillory awaited, a crude wooden contraption with openings for your skull and wrists. Positioned strategically in the heart of the bustling town square, hours would crawl by as you remained trapped and defenseless, while every resident launched their arsenal of rotting produce, filth, animal carcasses, and sometimes rocks directly at your exposed face. The agony extended far beyond physical wounds. You endured the raw contempt of everyone you had ever known. Crowds erupted in laughter, hurled insults, and showered you with saliva. This torture device transformed your suffering into the community's favorite blood sport, and should you provoke the mob beyond their limits, permanent disfigurement awaited, assuming you survived it all. Some unfortunate souls perished on the spot, overwhelmed by the sheer violence of public rage. Yet the pillory pales beside another degrading sentence: the drunkard's cloak. Various municipalities punished public intoxication by forcing offenders inside enormous wooden barrels with crude openings carved for head and limbs. Authorities then marched you throughout every street like a human beer keg, transforming you into a living punchline for universal ridicule. The experience proved uncomfortable, mortifying, and physically draining. But the deepest wound targeted your social standing. Your personal failings became neighborhood knowledge, and that shame haunted you indefinitely. Your flesh healed, but your tarnished reputation remained forever scarred. Consider now the most nightmarish judicial practice: pressing, officially termed peine forte, a door. Refusing to enter any plea represented direct rebellion against royal authority. Their response? Binding you flat against earth, while methodically piling massive stones across your torso until bones snapped out, lungs collapsed. Physical branding represented just one method of creating lifelong reminders of criminal behavior. Public flogging served as another crowd favorite. These beatings became scheduled spectacles, with offenders secured to wooden posts, while whips carved their backs into bloody ribbons. The sharp crack of leather meeting flesh blended with agonized screams that reverberated across every town plaza. The horror deepened when flogging merely served as your opening act. Many sentences combined this brutality with transportation, meaning that after enduring public degradation and permanent scarring, authorities shipped you overseas to penal settlements like Australia or colonial America for years of back-breaking labor. Freedom vanished alongside your homeland, your dwelling, and every person you cherished, all stripped away through one merciless judicial decision. Certain punishments showcase disturbing ingenuity in their design. Consider the fate awaiting women branded as scolds or gossips. The scold's bridle. This iron cage locked around the skull featured a flat metal tongue that pressed against the mouth's interior. Once secured, victims could neither speak, cry out, nor swallow normally. They endured forced marches through neighborhoods while residents mocked their enforced silence. This contraption delivered punishment, humiliation, and suppression simultaneously. The most disturbing element: many targeted women posed no genuine threat. They simply irritated influential men through ordinary conversation. Naval justice proved equally merciless toward male offenders. Desertion or rebellion could trigger flogging around the fleet, requiring the condemned sailors transport between vessels for ritual beatings before each crew. This might involve dozens of ships, hundreds of witnesses, and miles of shoreline. Every lash reopened wounds while ocean salt intensified the agony. Every witness memorized your shame. Every neighbor understood your transgression. And your flesh bore permanent testimony through gaping wounds that eventually became raised scars. These marks announced your guilt more powerfully than any verbal admission. Yet sometimes physical agony failed to satisfy the authorities. They craved absolute terror, which summoned the nightmarish spectacle of drawing and quartering. Reserved primarily for high treason, but still practiced throughout the Georgian era. This execution began with partial hanging, just enough to bring you to death's threshold before cutting you down for the true horror. Executioners would slice open your abdomen, extracting internal organs while you remained conscious to witness your own dismantlement. Finally, they severed each limb before boiling your severed head in tar and mounting it on a spike as an eternal warning to passersby. These represented far more than mere punishments. They were government-sanctioned nightmare performances. The implicit message rang crystal clear: defy our power, and your flesh becomes our canvas for demonstrating absolute obedience through systematic destruction. Not every barbaric act originated from robed judges or professional executioners wielding sharp instruments. Sometimes ordinary townsfolk, empowered by legal authorization, delivered their own brutal justice. Dishonest bakers, caught selling underweight loaves, faced being dragged through streets on wooden sleds, with their fraudulent bread dangling from their necks. What began as ritualized humiliation could escalate into something far more vicious should the assembled crowd grow bloodthirsty. Citizens launched stones, excrement, or whatever projectiles they discovered, transforming shame-based punishment into public carnage. Picture enduring attacks not merely from legal authorities, but from the collective rage of every starving belly throughout your community. Countless sentences were deliberately crafted to torment you for decades beyond the initial punishment. Thieves frequently faced transportation after enduring public beatings and often being lashed through city streets, were crammed onto vessels bound for distant penal settlements in colonial America or later Australia. The maritime journey itself constituted torture. Overcrowded cargo holds, rampant illness, human waste, and months of oceanic misery. Reaching your destination offered no guarantee of survival, and should you somehow live, liberty became nothing but distant memory. You transformed into forced labor property, banished permanently from everything familiar. Transportation essentially amounted to executing someone in slow motion, spreading their suffering across vast oceans and entire lifespans. Crimes involving speech, ridicule, defamation, or inflammatory preaching triggered punishments specifically designed to steal your voice. Among the most revolting was tongue piercing, where authorities drove heated iron rods through the organ that had offended them. These wounds left victims unable to articulate clearly ever again, literally branding their vocal cords as criminal. Speaking became scarred evidence of past transgressions. Picture a tempting conversation for your remaining years, knowing listeners heard not your arguments or thoughts, but the permanent speech impediment marking your punishment. This savagery extended beyond adults. Children also fell victim to this merciless system. During periods when destitution ruled daily life, youngsters frequently stole food simply to avoid starvation. Their sentences matched adult penalties: public floggings, pillory confinement, or execution for repeated violations. Historical records document 7-year-olds swinging from gallows while festival-like crowds gathered below. These displays targeted not just the condemned child, but every parent witnessing the spectacle. Control your offspring, or watch them dance at rope's end. Authorities would plunge them repeatedly into icy rivers or murky ponds, then yank them upward while they gasped desperately for air, only to force them underwater once more. Entire communities assembled on nearby bridges and shorelines to observe, cackling as each woman gagged and fought for breath. Her flesh would be dragged through filth and raw sewage. Technically, execution was never the official goal, yet drownings occurred frequently. Often, mere survival was irrelevant. The public display mattered most. At this point, you might assume death offered the ultimate escape. However, in Georgian Britain, sometimes continuing to live proved far more torturous. Criminals receiving sentences of flogging or branding were released bearing visible, eternal evidence of their transgressions. Communities refused forgiveness, employers denied work, and neighbors maintained grudges indefinitely. Your punishment never truly ended. It haunted every subsequent day. Simply walking through familiar streets meant encountering constant stares that reinforced your guilt, ensuring you remained forever tainted. This represented the twisted brilliance behind 18th century law enforcement. Rehabilitation was never the objective, permanent social exile was. Just when this judicial system seemed incapable of inventing fresh nightmares, authorities introduced hanging in chains while victims remained conscious. Though uncommon, certain treason cases resulted in criminals being locked inside iron cages and suspended before death claimed them. Exposed to harsh weather, they slowly starved, dehydrated, and withered away, while ravens tore at their features and insects invaded their deteriorating flesh. Crowds assembled not to witness executions, but to observe the gradual dissolution of human life stretched across agonizing days. When death finally arrived, that horrific spectacle remained forever seared into every observer's memory. Women accused of moral violations, prostitution, or merely defying societal expectations endured punishments specifically engineered to obliterate their public dignity. The whipping cart represented one such horror. Victims were stripped bare from the waist upward, bound to wheeled platforms, and paraded throughout neighborhoods while lashes tore across their exposed backs. Assembled crowds unleashed their self-righteous fury through verbal abuse, hurled refuse, and flying stones. This torture transcended mere physical agony, transformed each woman into a living emblem of shame, displayed for universal condemnation. These ordeals functioned equally as community entertainment and individual torment. Certain punishments abandoned public theater entirely, focusing instead on prolonged private suffering. Within debtors' prisons, individuals owing money faced years of confinement in putrid cells, overflowing with fellow inmates and rampant disease. Infection saturated the stagnant air, while countless prisoners never escaped alive. Technically, debtors bore no criminal status. Yet their sentence involved gradual deterioration within shadowy dungeons, perishing incrementally for the transgression of impoverishment. Some captives pleaded for overseas transportation simply to flee these decomposing institutional walls. At least Exile offered minimal survival prospects. The system demonstrated zero compassion toward beggars either. Vagrancy and panhandling laws received ruthless enforcement across numerous municipalities. Genuinely disabled individuals received begging permits, but anyone caught fabricating injuries or feigning blindness could face execution by hanging. Death became the penalty for desperate theatrics. Despite these lethal risks, countless destitute souls attempted such deceptions anyway. Starvation proved more powerful than terror. When authorities exposed their fraudulent performances, these executions became additional grim teachings etched into collective community consciousness. This punishment served as the ultimate nightmare specter. Every citizen understood its implications and desperately hoped never to witness such horror firsthand. While the wheel embodied gradual, bone-crushing torment, execution by fire aimed to terrorize through flames. Though increasingly uncommon during the Georgian period, burning remained reserved for offenses like counterfeiting or treasonous acts. Victims found themselves lashed to wooden stakes surrounded by dry kindling, confronting the terror of flames consuming their living flesh. Occasionally, merciful executioners would strangle condemned individuals before fire fully ignited. However, when compassion failed, their agonized screams carried far beyond town squares, drifting on winter winds into the recurring nightmares of every observer. Maritime punishments proved equally bizarre and brutal. Keel hauling represented one particularly revolting naval execution method. Condemned sailors were bound with thick ropes and dragged beneath ship hulls, scraping against razor-sharp barnacles and splintered wooden planks. Before being hauled upward on the opposite side, survivors typically drowned as seawater flooded their lungs. while barnacle edges shredded their flesh into bloody strips. Those who somehow lived faced inevitable infection and prolonged death. Naval discipline transcended mere order maintenance. It aimed to instill such profound terror that crew members would never contemplate disobedience again. Yet punishments were not always lethal or gory spectacles. Some were crafted simply to make existence unbearable. Village gossips and chronic troublemakers faced cucking stool sentences in certain communities. Victims were secured into chairs attached to wooden beams and repeatedly plunged into frigid rivers, choking and sputtering between submersions. Humiliation cut as deeply as the icy water while neighbors cheered from riverbanks, transforming individual suffering into collective entertainment. Public executions transcended individual criminal deaths. They served to maintain obedience among thousands of witnesses. Branding extended beyond marking one person's flesh. It ensured entire communities recognized what treachery physically resembled. Georgian society transformed punishment into theatrical performance, creating grotesque stages where every criminal simultaneously played actor and victim, while everyone else formed the captive audience. Yet these stages could prove even more merciless. Picture receiving sentences involving not merely agony, but gradual starvation within suspended cages. Consider being flogged so viciously that skin peeled away in bloody strips, then being paraded before former neighbors. Envision permanent silencing through iron devices forced between your teeth, or marching in shackles toward world's edge, never glimpsing home again. These represented more than punishments. They systematically erased individual identity, reducing human beings into cautionary examples. Perhaps the most revolting aspect was not the methods themselves, but their execution in brilliant daylight while communities applauded, ridiculed, and celebrated. Punishment was not concealed behind institutional walls. It saturated everyday existence. Children matured watching men being whipped until blood flowed freely, women being gagged with metal masks, and thieves dangling lifelessly in roadside cages. Savagery was not exceptional, it was completely ordinary. By the late 1700s, global perspectives were evolving. Enlightenment principles spread rapidly. Philosophers challenged institutional cruelty, and reform discussions grew increasingly vocal. However, while intellectual minds scribbled away in private studies, streets continued echoing with screams from those punished through ancient methods. Change approached gradually, yet for that century's condemned souls, compassion remained utterly illusory. Justice extended far beyond simple retribution, aimed to render victims utterly useless, transforming them into living cautionary tales branded not through scars, but through deliberate absence itself. Transportation and exile perhaps best exemplified the twisted creativity of 18th century punishment. Thousands were crammed into prison hulks, decaying vessels anchored along the Thamesby for being shipped toward remote colonial settlements. Shipboard conditions proved so horrific that countless prisoners perished before glimpsing distant shores. Those surviving the oceanic nightmare discovered colonies offering no liberation, only endless bondage and forced labor. Beneath scorching suns, amid rampant disease and persistent starvation, punishment stretched across years, decades, and complete lifespans. Gallows ropes could end lives within minutes, yet exile destroyed souls gradually, piece by agonizing piece. Despite these grotesque pageants, the most spine-chilling reality remains this: such punishments were never concealed. Authorities did not conduct them within secret dungeons or whisper about them in shadowy corners. Instead, they performed these spectacles under brilliant daylight, while entire communities assembled as though attending celebratory festivals. Children perched atop parental shoulders while vendors hawked beer and meat pies. Joyous laughter intermingled with tortured screams. Punishment transcended mere legal sentences. It became mass entertainment, ritualistic ceremony, communal spectacle, demanding universal participation. Georgian society did not simply punish lawbreakers, it conditioned the public to crave witnessing such displays. Modern observers might assume we have evolved beyond these grotesque theaters of agony and degradation. Yet have we truly progressed? While we no longer gather in town squares watching bodies contort on hanging ropes, crowds still assemble digitally, gorging themselves on humiliation and ridicule.